Hi, I'm Jocelyn Cesari, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the third installment of the book talk series of the Religion and IR section. We have today a very distinguished panel of experts on the topic, which is about religion and soft power. And before I give the floor to my colleagues, I just want to say a few words about the goal of the book talk series, which is to create bridges between our section on religion and the other main component and research of the ISA, from nationalism to foreign policy, to conflicts and so on. So we want to showcase in this book talk series a particular work that really does bridge the religion section work with other main component of the ISA. So without further ado, I now give the floor to my colleagues.
The title is Religious and Economic Soft Power in Ghana-Turkey Relations. The reason for this rather obscure topic is because I've shifted my research focus to Ghana, and I've just written a book about politics in Ghana. So I thought it a good idea to try to bring in Turkey's role there, because Turkey is becoming a major player in Ghana, in West Africa, in relation both to its religious profile and to its economic development. So the title reflects Turkey's two-pronged approach to building its influence in Ghana. It's using both what I'm going to call religious soft power and economic soft power. And I say in the paper and in the presentation that this is not really smart power, because smart power is always dependent on some notion of hard power, often military power. So this is, I think, a fairly unusual example of two forms of soft power, religious and economic soft power. And I'd like to explain in briefly. The paper is 7,000 or 8,000 words, so obviously I won't cover that much. Explaining in 10 minutes what the paper is about, why it's necessary, if you like, and what it seeks to tell us about religious soft power. So Turkey's government seeks to apply both religious soft power and economic soft power to increase its influence in Ghana. Until recently, Turkey was very uninvolved in Africa, including West Africa. But it's become more involved in recent years, both for economic reasons and to counter what it calls the Fethullah Gulen terrorist network. So it's become a major player, not exactly replacing, but in addition to Egypt and to some degree Pakistan, and to a much lesser degree, Libya. And Turkey's religious soft power relationship with Ghana comes with economic sweeteners, because Ghana has just opened a national mosque, the new national mosque, which has been on the drawing board in Ghana for 20 years, but they couldn't come up with the money. And the Turkish government has provided the money, although Turkish government pretends it's Turkish NGOs that have provided the money, but it's come from the government. And at the same time, Turkey is also building a very burgeoning economic relationship with Ghana. Ghana, a typical African country, sends raw materials, and Turkey sends in return manufacturers. But it's a growing relationship which hasn't been there in the past, and reflects to some degree an element of religious soft power, which I will say a little bit more about in a minute. So what does Turkey want? Well, perhaps unsurprisingly, its overall aim is to increase the country's influence in Ghana, which is part of a wider initiative to expand regional influence in Africa. Turkey is becoming a major player in many parts of Africa, but Ghana is one of the countries which is particularly prominent in the burgeoning relationship with Turkey. Ghana is a country of nearly 30 million people. It's got a very it's got quite a high profile in West Africa and in Africa more generally. And why Ghana? Well, it's important to Turkey because it's regarded as a strategically important African country, one of the region's few democracies, and an economic success, which among African countries is quite a rare combination for the two to go together. So the paper on which this presentation is based seeks to assess Turkey's various forms of influence and considers what Turkey hopes to achieve in foreign policy terms. 4 sections of the paper. The first examines religious soft power and burgeoning Turkey-Ghana relations, noting that recently relations have become closer and more cordial, involving both religious and non-religious aspects. Ghana is a country of 30 million people, 70% of them are Christians, and Muslims comprise about 20%. So there's a significant Muslim minority, and Islam in Ghana is very much based on a form of Islam which is influenced a lot by by Sufism. It's a very fragmented faith in Ghana. There's no particular ethnic group which is predominantly Muslim. So it's very fragmented. Muslims have been traditionally marginal, and they've become, in recent times, more politically assertive, something which Turkey has latched on to and sought to influence. And it's just worth noting that Ghana is in a region where forms of jihadism are very prominent, both in Mali, in Burkina Faso, to some degree in Cote d'Ivoire, and Ghana is one of the few West African countries where, let me call it, jihadism has not spread. So the government of Ghana and the government of Turkey are very keen to keep that situation as it is, one where extremism is kept out of the country. Third section assesses recent Ghana-Turkey relations, including the expansion of Turkey's religious soft power, which is exemplified in 3 particular developments. The new National Mosque. I mean, I don't know if any of you have seen it, but it's a carbon copy of the Blue Mosque in Istanbul. It looks most incongruous in a West African country. Suddenly there's a huge Turkish-style mosque sitting there. It's been encouraging Islamic education, building the schools, paying for running of the schools, and seeking to encourage Muslims to engage in what it regards as Islamic education. And thirdly, on the security aspect, very keen for Ghana's government to curtail what it calls the Fethullah terrorist organization. Third section also looks at the role of Turkey's economic soft power, just to highlight that the relationship between the two is based not just on religion, but also on economic issues. Fourth section looks at the techniques which the government of Ghana has used to try to increase its influence in Ghana, including both religious soft power and economic soft power. And this is not coercive. The government of Ghana broadly welcomes Turkey's influence because it wants its Muslims to be quiescent and it wants to build the economy. So Turkey is a welcome partner. And from a religious point of view, Turkey's non-radical Sunni orthodoxy is viewed as very unlikely to stimulate radicalization among Ghana's Muslims, while Turkey's economic presence is welcomed as an important means to help further build Ghana's economy. So question might be, is this smart power in operation? And I suggest that the growing influence of Turkey is not limited to its ability to project religious soft power. And it includes, in addition, as I mentioned, a burgeoning economic relationship. Bilateral trade was worth $570 million in 2020. Not huge, but growing year by year. And Turkey's use of both religious and economic soft power has not really been noted in the relevant literature when looking at Turkey's expansion of its foreign policy into Africa, West Africa included. the question is, does Turkey use smart power? Well, everyone listening, I think, will know that smart power is a term which seeks to bring together aspects of both soft power and hard power. Just a Crocker's definition you'll see on the screen. Strategic use of diplomacy, including the engagement of both military force and all forms of diplomacy. Well, Turkey uses lots of diplomacy, but there's no coercion, there's no hard power involved. So this isn't a kind of a archetypal example of smart power. It's what I would call a dual soft power way of Turkey building influence. So it's an unusual example of the use of both religious and non-religious, that is economic, soft power. I just briefly note in the paper that in Turkey itself, President Erdogan has been in power for 20 years or more and has used smart power to appeal consistently to a large portion of the Turkish electorate. So within Turkey itself, Erdogan uses smart power to kind of build his appeal. Quote there from an academic that highlights that. And then finally, Erdogan's smart power is used in Turkey's efforts to encourage some African governments to adopt policies and programs which find favor with his government, typically poorer countries that are heavily reliant on various forms of external assistance. So for poor African countries, unlike Ghana, Turkey can use a form of smart power to both encourage and coerce African governments to go with Turkey's influence. But in Ghana, it's a less poor country with a significant Muslim minority. Under Erdogan, Turkey employs a combination of religious and non-religious soft power to try to gain influence and leverage. And there's finally the five examples I'm using: increased bilateral trade, which is 2-to-1 to Turkey's advantage; improve the position of Ghana's marginal Muslims via both religion and education. Crucially, this is highly symbolic, this $10 million funding for the new National Mosque, which I would urge you to have a look at online because it's the most incongruous building that you will ever see virtually, an Istanbul type big mosque stuck on the street of Accra. To include Ghanaian Muslims in education opportunities, to increase the profile of Muslims in Ghana and to enable them to compete with the Christians, because Christians are utterly dominant in the country. And finally, enlisting Ghana's government in Turkey's conflict with the Fethullah Gulen terrorist network. Thank you very much, everybody. Sorry for rushing through it, and I was slightly over time, but thanks for bearing with me.
Great. So thanks everyone for being here. I'm Peter Henne from University of Vermont, and I'm going to talk a bit about some of my research on both soft power in general and religious soft power. And start off with just an example. Back in the 1960s, King Faisal of Saudi Arabia was concerned about the growing influence of Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt and his sort of secular revolutionary pan-Arabism. One of the ways Faisal tried to counter this was by trying to form an Islamic pact, basically an alliance among conservative Muslim states. So on the one hand, we could say, sure, this is religious soft power. It's appealing to religion to gain influence. But there's a few complications with it. It wasn't sort of this general attractive power. We think of soft power as more of a direct appeal, direct use and operationalization of religion. Also, the effects were rather disruptive and complicated. And so this example raises a couple of issues with the way we try to study and talk about soft power, and then religious soft power specifically that I'm going to get to in this presentation. First, what is soft power? I guess we're all going to do this, so I'll go through it quickly. But right, based on Nye's work, it's this sort of attractive, non-coercive power. It's the ability to get others to want what you want, right, rather than do what you want. The way it's spread is through things like public diplomacy, having a vibrant culture. So then religious soft power would be this sort of attractive power, but based specifically on religious credibility, on your traditions, on your appeals to religion. Very important, very powerful concept, but we do run into some issues trying to study it. And so when I think about this debate we engage in, right, does religious soft power matter? It's sort of stuck between these two poles, right? There's the religious triumphalists, those who think that religion is this powerful force that can transform international security. By appealing to religion, you can change what states care about. Or the religion skeptics, people who think, well, religion might matter domestically, it might matter in certain cultural areas, but when it comes to security, it's not going to come up at all. And so we want to if we want to demonstrate religious soft power matters, we need to deal with these opposing views. So one of the big issues I think we run into with soft power is stretching the definition too much, so it becomes almost unusable, and anything that's not military power becomes soft power. So some examples I've come upon, and I discussed these in an international studies perspective article I had about a year ago. An article talked about Iran pursuing a soft power approach by supporting ideological proxies, and that's ideological, right? But that's not quite what we mean by attractive power. Another article talked about a soft power approach to ISIS based on economic development, and that is not military, but again, I wouldn't say that's soft power. After Russia invaded Crimea, the Obama administration tried to mobilize international opinion, and some discuss this as a soft power approach, which doesn't quite fit to me. And so by stretching the definition of soft power to include all these different areas, it makes it easy for policymakers to dismiss it. It's like, this doesn't mean anything. It also makes it hard for scholars to study it because it's this vague policy buzzword we can't wrap our heads around. So I've tried to clarify it a bit, and this is from that international studies perspective article I mentioned. And one is, I think we need to be really clear on the relationship between soft power and material resources, right? That soft power can complement them. So like America, a very powerful state that also has soft power that attracts others to us, or it can substitute for them. Think Jordan, relatively weak state, but because of its position in the Middle East, states often turn to it. And then be clear if we're talking about a state actively trying to advance its soft power, such as through investing in public diplomacy, or it's more passive, such as just having a culture everyone wants to be a part of. So that's one step I think we need to do, is clarifying this relationship. The other, I think, and this might be a little controversial, but I think we need to recognize that soft power is only one type of what some call cultural or symbolic instruments of power, meaning ways states have to influence others that do not rely on military or economic resources. So soft power is really this attempt to integrate international coalitions, draw people to your side, that's rather diffuse, right? You're not targeting one state, you're building up these soft power attributes or resources that pull others to you. So it fits in that one quadrant there. That leaves a lot of different other areas where states can use cultural or symbolic instruments of power to their advantage, to build coalitions directly by targeting states with appeals to beliefs, or to break apart rivals. And there's been some attempt to stretch the meaning of smart power. There's a sharp power has come out, things like that, to use ideology to go after rivals. And I worry that's not going to be that effective. Instead, we need to isolate soft power to where it really fits, and then come up with different terms for these other quadrants. I don't have great terms for them yet. Like integrative direct power is not helpful, but at least we have a way to clarify this. So this is soft power in general. What does it mean for religious soft power? We think religious soft power is a very specific form of a state turning to a cultural or symbolic instrument of power. It can either replace or complement material resources. We need to be clear on that. And let's be careful not to stretch the definition, so when we study things, we can demonstrate clear effects. Okay. But this does leave unanswered that question of, could soft power be an active foreign policy tool? Right, not just a passive force, but something we can appeal to. This is going to be coming from a book I have forthcoming called, appropriately enough, Religious Appeals and Power Politics. How do states appeal to religion in international crises, and what happens? And I found that it does have a big impact depending on the credibility of the state on religious issues, and then the material incentives facing the target. Do they have incentive to go along or not? Just a couple of quick examples. These are chapters from the book. I mentioned the Saudi example. What happened here was states were receptive to the Islamic Pact. It never really came together. What did happen was that Egypt and other revolutionary Arab states got really nervous about it, saw this as a direct threat to their rule. It really upped the tensions in the region. America, during the War on Terror, tried to promote this moderate Islam or promote religious outreach and engagement. And it's a nice, non-military approach. There are some positive effects, but it ended up not really working the way we wanted to. We were a little unclear on how to implement these programs, so there are wasted resources. There's a lot of suspicion about what America's real intentions were because we weren't that credible on, defending Muslims. Finally, just Putin and Vladimir Putin in Russia and his appeals to traditional values to build up far-right coalitions. That has worked by saying, I'm the defender of true Christian beliefs. There's been some political gain there, but we've seen some problems, right? It's raised a lot of tensions of Russia, a suspicion about Russia and what they're up to. It's also led to suspicions about religious conservative involvement in politics in various countries. And as we saw with the invasion of Ukraine, it didn't matter where it needed to matter for Russia, in that he wasn't able to mobilize this coalition in support of him. And so just to close this off, what does this tell us about religious soft power? I would say that religious soft power is only the first step. It's how you build up your credibility on religious issues. But you need to actually mobilize that through these religious appeals to gain support in power politics. In terms of the effects of religious soft power, neither of these religious skeptic nor traditional triumphalist views are accurate. Religion is incredibly powerful, incredibly important, but its effects tend to be disruptive and slip out of your control really quickly. So scholars need to recognize this, but policymakers do as well. Policymakers cannot ignore religion. It's always going to be there, but be a little bit wary about how you turn to it in your foreign policy because it can blow up in your face. Great. Thank you for your attention.
First of all, Justin, thank you so much for the invitation and for the invitation for the special issue. Today, I'm going to talk about my article that has been published at the very end of 2021. The title is Islam and Foreign Policy, Turkey's Ambivalent Religious Soft Power in the Authoritarian Turn. As most of you know, although the pro-democratic agenda of Turkey's Justice and Development Party, AKP, gained a significant and particularly international credibility through the very beginning of the new millennium, the party has since roughly after 2010 experienced a dramatic authoritarian process, or that we can call democratic decline. Within this democratic decline, AKP has used different types of tools, and one of the tools is the overdose use of Islam, both at home and abroad, to consolidate its base to support under the leadership of undisputable President Erdogan. Within this Erdogan has been calling this type of policies and Turkey as a new Turkey, and the new Turkey is a new kind of foreign policy. And within this foreign policy, Islam, particularly Sunni Islam, has become both an instrument and an object of repressive AKP's policies. And Turkey has emerged as one of the front runner in a race among the countries increasingly using religion as a foreign policy tool, as Jeff underlined the Ghana case. From my point of view, within this article, this new role for Turkey has created a kind of a disputable point of view, even though we can define it as a kind of a instrumentalization of Islam in foreign policy and or religious soft power. I argue that not only in this article, but most of my studies, I think if we would like to define Turkey's instrumentalization of Islam in foreign policy, using a pure soft power is not that's satisfactory from my point of view. I think Turkey's use of Islam, looking for different country cases, is an example of how soft power, religious soft power, has an ambivalent nature, because implementation is something different, but how the other countries has been observing this implementation is another thing. So from my point of view, if we would like to define religious soft power, the producer point of view is only one part of the coin, but the coin has another part about the host countries, how they can observe that. And currently, Turkey has been running mosques around 78 countries in the world, and I had an opportunity to visit at least half of them and to conduct an interview with their imams and the host countries' representatives. And in these circumstances, I define Turkey's use of religious soft power has an ambivalent nature. What I'm trying to say that, I mean, from 2002 to the early 2010s, Turkey underwent a binary transformation through the use of Sunni Islam in foreign policy, very much relating to the developments in domestic politics. But the AKP administrators, policymakers, particularly Erdogan, who heavily emphasized Islamic values, particularly between 2002, I would say roughly 2007 and 8, and they deprioritized the religious appearance. However, when they felt very comfortable in domestic politics, and I mean, many different indicators has played a huge role within this comfort zone after defeating the secular tutelage, after they gained the clash between the Gülen movements. They feel very comfortable, and they began to modify and create a new tools and the new instruments, strategies, and language. And within this language, although this change could functionalize Islamic institutions, this didn't happen directly. What I observed that after 2010, after 2013, and after 2016, both of them been addressing at different critical junctions within the Turkish domestic politics, we have been observing the overdose use of Islam in Turkish foreign policy. But this overdose use of Islam has been welcomed by some of countries, but also has been creating some kind of distribution in some of the other countries. For example, while we have been observing a very much welcome attitude from North Macedonia, the same policies, the same institutions, the same language has been rejecting widely from France, for example. This is about how we have been observing these institutions. For example, currently I'm in Stockholm, and I've been having some meetings with the foreign ministry staff, and they've been very much concerned to use overdose use of Islam in Turkish foreign policy. Actually, this is why I'm saying it has an ambivalent structure, because when we have been comparing Turkey's activities in different parts of the world, most of the strategies, pretty much all of the tools are quite similar, but the reactions are very, very different. What I would say that, to cut it short, while the debates of religion featured in internal impacts and those in countless domains after 1980s, the context of the religious soft power with these institutions has been creating a different dimensions. The Jeffrey Haynes, Peter Mandaville, Peter Henne, you, Jocelyn, you are very much the pioneer of this religious soft power studies. But today, it is clear that Turkey's policies under the repressive authoritarian AKP rule have, however, different effects on different actors in different regions. Some groups, some countries are rather happy with Turkey's religiously fueled approach, while some others are seriously concerned. This is why I prefer to define Turkey as an ambiguous actor that has been instrumentalized its power and its impact resources in hybrid ways, and within this hybrid way, Islam has been playing a huge role. Even though it is very possible to argue that Turkey's Islam-based foreign policy, Sunni Islam-based foreign policy, and new activities could be categorized within the concept of soft power or public diplomacy. This policy preferences is multi-faced and has many problematic aspects, such as exportation of domestic conflicts, such as outreaching the boundaries of serving to the Muslims, so on and so forth. Therefore, maybe this is the part that we've been separating from Jeff's study. I would define Turkey's activities when we look at the globally. It is definitely a religious soft power. It is not a sharp power. It is not a clear, smart power. But if we would like to define this soft power's nature, I would like to say that it has an ambivalent nature. Let me stop in here and maybe we can clarify some gray points during the Q&A section. Thank you so much, Justin, again, for the opportunity.
Great. Thank you very much, Jocelyn, and greetings to everyone. I'm grateful for the opportunity to be with you today. I don't actually have a research monograph to speak about. Rather, what I want to talk a little bit about is the project that I've been leading at the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs over the last few years, the Geopolitics of Religious Soft Power project, one that many of the speakers, and I think I saw also a couple of the colleagues joining us in the audience today, have been part of, contributed to, and it's sort of sought to be a space that can serve to aggregate and to helpfully begin to systematize the work that we're all doing in this field. There have been a couple of, I think, helpful outputs emerging from that project, one of which is this book here, Wahhabism in the World, Understanding Saudi Arabia's Global Influence on Islam, which came out with Oxford University Press a few months back, which has tried to kind of be a systematic and comprehensive analytic portrait of the phenomenon of Saudi religious transnationalism, this idea of Saudi Arabia's quote-unquote export of Wahhabism that we've been talking about and discussing for decades now, but which has never actually been kind of fully and systematically studied. So this volume, which brings together a broad range of scholars from different disciplines and with different forms of regional and country expertise, as well as historians, to kind of give us to tell the story of Saudi Arabia's quote-unquote export of Wahhabism, beginning in many ways with the Saudi-led Islamic Pact that Peter Henne referenced as one of the examples of a particular valence of religious soft power in his remarks just now. The Geopolitics of Religious Soft Power project also has another edited volume coming out with Oxford in a few months, which is simply called The Geopolitics of Religious Soft Power, How States Use Religion in Foreign Policy. Again, quite a few of the participants here have contributed chapters to that volume, including, I think, a helpful contribution co-authored by Peter Henne and Gregorio Betiza, who I think was with us for at least part of the webinar today, that begins to think more theoretically and informed by the work also of course, Jeff Haynes's early work on religious soft power, the important work that I think Jocelyn herself has done in cueing us and kind of bringing the state back into the way that we think about the intersection of religion and in international relations. They're really, I think, moving forward that project of beginning to theorize the phenomenon more broadly. If I want to sort of quickly summarize the work that I've been doing more recently, I'll share in the chat box here a link to an article I published a couple of months back through the Observatoire International des Religieux that tries to kind of capture and summarize the import of this growing trend by which a number of kind of great revanchist and emerging powers seem to increasingly incorporate various forms of religious engagement and support for religious causes into their foreign policy repertoire as a tool. And so that article is sort of built around a series of vignettes that looks, for example, at the close relationship that has grown up over the years between the Kremlin and the Russian Orthodox Church. Peter Henne already alluded to Russia's considerable success in positioning itself as a global champion of quote unquote traditional and family values in ways that has allowed it to help to animate and solidify networks on the political right in Europe, but to also serve as a channel that has allowed it to reach out to more conservative audiences in the global south, in places like the sub-Saharan Africa, in the Middle East as well. But I think more interestingly, as a hub within a truly global network of traditional and family values-based activism that often manifests itself institutionally and organizationally in the level of civil society, but often through civil society actors that are either proxies for or have some great proximity to state actors. So, you know, we can talk today about the ways in which Russian-backed families values entities, including some working at the sort of intergovernmental level, like the Congress of World Families, you know, backed with Russian money, close to the Russian Orthodox Church, interacts in or makes common cause with, for example, entities that are connected to the broader transnational Hindutva movement with their own ties to groups like the RSS that have some proximity to the ruling BJP party in India, who in turn have their own interesting networks that cross-fertilize with conservative evangelical networks here in the United States. I think at some level, it's interesting to me because at a time when we see some commentators kind of talking about the idea that maybe the present state of world affairs seems to lend renewed credence to the whole Huntington Clash of Civilizations thesis, to my mind, what we're seeing now is actually yet further evidence that Huntington got it fundamentally wrong, because on his model of these supposedly insular, closed civilizational entities, it shouldn't be possible for an Orthodox world to make common cause and work politically and geopolitically with a Hindu world working in concert with this Islamic bloc that he posits separately, and then a sort of, you know, Christian Protestant bloc. And yet what we actually see is quite a lot of healthy cooperation and cross-fertilization across these spaces. And so the work that I'm doing now, and I should just add that I'm presently not based at my usual home of George Mason University, but I'm on a leave of absence working at the United States Institute of Peace, is to kind of look at the ways in which this increased engagement with religion and religious actors in great power rivalry geopolitics potentially has impact on some of the more, you know, conflict and peace dynamics in various regions, and the ways in which certain actors, including the People's Republic of China, a country that is usually identified either with the suppression of religion or more recently with the commission of mass atrocities against its own Muslim population, we see evidence today that China is actually drawing on its the sort of the history of Chinese Buddhism as a soft power tool in order to build a favorable image for itself with communities and societies whose geography, interestingly enough, maps very closely to the geography of the Belt and Road initiative. And so these are some of the kinds of dynamics geopolitics that I'm looking at, very much influenced by this idea of sacred capital that Gregorio Betiza has offered to us as a way to begin to understand why certain countries seem to have the capacity to make use of what we're calling religious soft power more successfully than certain other countries. But more broadly, I think trying to read this new geopolitics of religion against a backdrop of changing world order, and the idea that it is precisely at these moments when world order is shifting that and we find ourselves in ongoing renewed debates about meaning, identity, purpose, vision. At moments like that, forces in society that have historically been conventional sources of those concepts of worldview, identity, purpose, values have increased salience. And for that reason, I think it's all the more interesting in this moment of world order shift to pay attention to these new eruptions and eruptions of religion within geopolitical space. So I'll leave it there and very much look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
So we have a question in the chat, and we also have a question in the Q&A if anybody would like to take a stab. In the chat, the question is, if China closed its political ideology in the garb of Buddhism, does it then become a sharp power tool where one is seeking to coerce by use of deception?
I mean, my sense in looking at what China is doing in this space is that it's not taking communist ideology and repackaging it or reframing it with reference to a set of rhetorical and symbolic reference points grounded in Chinese Buddhism, but rather operating in a far more conventional soft power way of, trying to find ways to build support within Buddhist communities in places like Sri Lanka and in Indonesia, certain parts of Indonesia where you have significant Buddhist populations, simply by trying to be able to say, there are other dimensions to China's long history, and let us remind you that China itself has historically been part of the story of Buddhism, and we therefore have, if you're looking for ways to connect to and understand yourself to be part of what China has been through its long history, we have ways to relate to the religious dimensions of your identity as well. It functions in some way as, what Putin has been doing, I think, skillfully in some regards. There are other areas where he got it, I think, entirely wrong, insofar as I think his efforts in Ukraine have thoroughly backfired in that what he's mainly achieved is, thoroughly alienating that branch of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church in Ukraine that has historically been affiliated with the Moscow Patriarchate. In other places, religion, I think, has been a very useful way for him to operationalize the whole Ruski Mir concept as a multivalent project that says, you don't necessarily have to be Russian. You don't have to be ethno-linguistically Russian. You don't have to be Slavic. You don't necessarily have to be Orthodox to be part of this story. If you are someone who is more in tune with conservative, quote unquote, family and traditional values, you can be part of the Ruski Mir construct by recognizing our role as the global champion and guardian of those values. And so I think it's provided a certain amount of flexibility in projecting a certain kind of strategically useful geopolitical identity for Russia. And I think China is essentially operating in the same mold with varying levels of success.
I can say something about the Benedict's question, if you don't mind. I mean, if we are talking about a poor soft power, that is, the discussion has been starting with Joseph Nye. Yes, I think within this current global order, soft power is one of the main indicators about the country's influence on the others. When we talk about like Norway and Sweden, I'm not sure about the Norwegian case, but I know pretty well to the Swedish case, for example. Yes, even though these countries are, in terms of population, they might be quite tiny, but when we look at their impact and using different tools such as education, culture, and food whatsoever, they are quite influential. For example, Sweden has an institution which is called the Swedish Institute that has been giving scholarship thousands of students all around the world and inviting them to the Sweden. They one way or another, not directly but indirectly, teaching them the Swedish culture and other Swedish ways of living. So they've been creating a kind of de facto informal ambassadors all around the world while using these institutions. And they know they don't have big hard powers most probably, but they know how to instrumentalize their soft power in a very clear and beneficial way. Yes, I mean, from a realistic point of view, yes, they are very much linked to the United States and the North Atlantic Security Council. This is the big topic in here in Sweden right now, for example, the NATO extension, but their soft power is quite different and quite a big indicator for their foreign policy.
There is a question, I think more for Jeff, on the role of Erdogan in Africa and his previous alliance with the Gulenists, and how persuasive is the pitch now of Erdogan in Africa, knowing the current, more than competition, attempt to eliminate the Gulenists in different parts of the world. So unless Peter Mandaville, you have already responded to that, maybe we should also ask Jeffrey to say a few things on that.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I will. The Gulen network was renowned for its educational opportunities offered in many countries around the world. I mean, dozens of countries around the world, and it was influential in Africa, particularly influential in Africa, where educational options and facilities are widely lacking, of course. So it was a question really of kids being able to go to school via the Gulenist network, and they're good schools, competent teachers, giving a good product at the end of the day. Once the Erdogan government fell out with Gulen and began to call them terrorists, the reaction in Africa, I mean, I can only really speak on a general way. I haven't looked at this in great detail. The Gulen network was in roughly 30 or more African countries offering education opportunities, a major resource. And some countries have gone with the Erdogan line, and they've completely dropped the Fethullah Gulen network and branded them terrorists and hounded them, and in some cases handed them out of the country. Others have been very ambivalent, and they've played both hands. They've kind of paid lip service to the Erdogan line, but also retained ties with Gulen, because if the Turkey government is offering educational facilities and the Gulen network is offering educational facilities, why not have both if you can get away with it? So it largely seems to be a question of how powerful or powerless is the African country in relation to Turkey. If it's a very poor African country that relies on Turkey, among others, for lots of resources, it will kowtow to them. If, on the other hand, you're like Ghana and you have quite a strong economy and a strong democratic position, you don't kowtow, you pay lip service to what Erdogan wants, but you try and get the best of both worlds and both get the resources from Turkey government, but also retain the Gulen network. What Turkey's government has been doing, however, is using underhand, in inverted commas, tactics to try to personally deal with leading members of the Gulen network in individual African countries. So there's kind of a dirty politics going on as well. But just to finally to answer Ed's question, it depends largely upon how much ability African countries have to sort of stand up to Turkey, but they're quite prepared to have education opportunities from anyone who will offer them, if they're bona fide and they're good educational facilities. And certainly the Gulen network offered that in many African countries.
May I add something to your answer, Jeff, if you don't mind?
Of course you can.
I think Turkish government has already realized what you said about the education, because they establish a new foundation, which is called Marif Foundation. And Marif means education in Ottoman language. And they're trying to overtake the Gülenist schools, both in Africa and in the Balkans, by using this new state-funded institution. But there is not that much credibility for this foundation. That is why it's not very successful.
Can I actually go back a little bit to this question about, Norway and Sweden, and does soft power matter? And that's the thing. It's like, I think it matters and I want it to matter, but we just don't have a lot of great evidence of it yet. And we have evidence of states trying to build really just soft power or soft power in general. But how do we know when it really has an impact? And that's what, with my book that's going to come out, I initially meant to find that impact. It's like, oh, this will be great. States appeal to religion, everyone flocks to them. And it just causes all these problems. And I think we need to, just live with that, which is the argument, but also find ways to really isolate the impact of soft power, which I think is it sort of enhances other ways you have of working with states that complementing your material resources. But again, we're not quite there yet. I've got a project I'm starting on this, so maybe in 6 months I can come back and give an answer, but it is hard to make the case for it, right? Because we don't have good evidence of soft power mattering independently of everything else.
Could I just briefly add something to what Peter's just said? I think it's an interesting case of Sweden and Norway. I don't think Sweden and Norway necessarily go very well together in terms of comparisons. Okay, they're in Scandinavia, but the thing about soft power is it seems to me mostly to be in the mind, as it were, that the idea is that if you believe a state, or indeed non-state actors have power, have a soft power, it implies that you're more than willing to listen to what they say and more than willing to go along with what they say. Very hard to measure because, of course, governments don't like to admit that others are influencing them in that way. They like to, like China, for example, show their independence and how they keep foreign influences at arm's length. But I think it's true to say that some countries demonstrably have soft power because their influence at the regional and global level is so much greater than you would expect looking at their hard power attributes only. And this is one reason why America once was thought to have such great soft power, because it could complement its influence with hard power. And so the power of America was manifested in two great ways. So I think Peter's right. The way how we see soft power in action is very difficult, probably maybe even impossible to gauge. Yet I think it's absolutely the case that some countries have soft power, not necessarily religious soft power, but some countries have soft power in a way which allows us to be fairly to conclude that soft power does mean something in international relations and is an attribute of some states which enables them to use the expression punch above their weight in the international arena. Thanks.
I would like to throw for the discussion something that I've been thinking along all your presentation that I heard despite the on and off. It seems to me that if we talk too much about instrumentalization by state, and it came up in Peter Henne presentation at some point, is it not in fact the opposite of soft power? Because the instrumentalization is a deliberate act of some state rulers to use religion for political purpose, okay? You don't see the state really taking an active role. There is, I think it's probably a legend, but I remember that when the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union collapsed, lots of my professor at the time was saying it's because of the soft power of America, the songs and the culture. This was not automatically forged and shaped by state action. And I think that the soft power is beyond, the state instrumentalization works as long as there is some kind of appeal of what the country has to offer. That's why when we look today at at Putin and the Russian Orthodox Church. There is a political project of the church beyond Putin. It happens that they go together, and leaders sometimes will take care or advantage of the state, and sometimes they don't. And I think that it came also in Ahmet's presentation. There are two aspects of it. There is this deliberate state action, but there are also soft power beyond the state. And actually the soft power, in my opinion, is beyond the state. By definition, army do not have our power. They are soft powers by definition. How would you qualify the global role of the Pope today? For me, it's typical soft power. Wahhabis, Peter mentioned just Wahhabis. Wahhabis is beyond the state, Saudi state initiative. Wahhabism has been successful because everywhere locally, people were ready to take this on. And there has been unfolding of the Wahhabi interpretation beyond the Saudi explicit projection or diffusion of it.
So if I can respond briefly, Jocelyn, I think
Yes,
you raise a really important point here. I guess one can think of this phenomenon, soft power, on a spectrum, right? There's the puritanical approach to soft power, where you're saying that it functions successfully independently and maybe even in spite of the state. Where you don't need any sort of state co-optation or manipulation of it. And that the more you have the state playing that role, the less it's actually operating as soft power. I think in reality, most manifestations that we're talking about today fall somewhere in the middle of that spectrum. We're not talking about cases where we're focused primarily on religious institutions that are truly state institutions that are functionally subservient completely to the state, and where the talking points of religious leaders are shaped by the executive branch of the government. We know that such things do exist in some places, but I think most of the examples we're citing today fall somewhere in the middle. You're absolutely right that in the case of Russia, this is not just Putin's instrumental use of the Russian Orthodox Church. It's a symbiotic relationship. Patriarch Kirill has his own agenda, and there's horse trading that goes on between them, where they help each other to advance their projects. Likewise, our finding with the book on Wahhabism is very much consistent with what you're saying, and it pushes back against the idea that there's somewhere in Riyadh a Wahhabism command and control center where people sit around and decide which Muslim country the Wahhabis will destroy next. Rather, Wahhabism has a transnational logic independent of the agenda of the Saudi state, even though the Saudi state has at times sought to harness it to its own purposes, which means that Saudi Arabia has not always been able to control what happens when Wahhabism enters a particular socio-political context around the world. And indeed, sometimes we find evidence that the effects that it has in local settings are actually sometimes the polar opposite of what the Saudi state would actually prefer happen. So thank you for raising that point.
thank you. You brought even better example than I did. Thank you, Peter. Thank you.
All right, everyone. In absence of any other information or discussion that people would like, oh, I'm sorry, we do have a question in the chat right now. It's addressed to Peter, if you'd like to take it.
I mean, some of it is, it's the power, right, is if you can get someone to do what you wanted them to do. And so if your states are appealing to religion in order to form an international coalition, and the coalition forms and stays together, that's an effective use of power. Ideally, you could demonstrate that happening in the it's to the exclusion of everything else, meaning like there are no other material reasons for doing it, no inertia reasons. You're unlikely to find that. And so there are more advanced statistical methods we can use where you can sort of take the effect of soft power almost as an intermediary variable. But in terms of case studies, it's really prying apart what really seemed to matter. So, I did archival research. I said, when Saudi Arabia said we're going to form an Islamic pact, how did other states respond? And the response was usually, oh, shoot, what is going on here, right? And so that it's an effect. We can demonstrate they're doing this because of the Islamic Pact. It just wasn't what they were expecting. So it gets really complicated to find this. And that's what I was trying to say, is that just because we don't have the evidence yet doesn't mean it's not there. It's, as Jeff Haynes was saying, it's just, we think it's out there, just we need to work harder to demonstrate it, to win over the skeptics in both the policy and the academic world.
I'd like to thank her and the panelists for a great session to kick off ISA's virtual programming for 2023. Thanks to our audience as well for being here and for contributing to the discussion. This is the third in a series of book talks put together by ISA's Religion and International Relations section, and we hope to see you at the next one in February, which will discuss scholarship on Sikh nationalism. When today's recording is available, we will email everyone who registered to let you know, and we will include details on that upcoming session. Please don't hesitate to reach out with any questions in the meantime. And again, we hope to see you again. Thank you all so much for coming.